Have you ever walked into a room and forgotten why you were there, only to laugh it off and blame stress, age, or a long day at work? What if those small lapses are not random at all, but early signals from a brain that has been quietly adapting to something you believed was harmless? In midlife, many adults normalize mental fog, slower recall, and subtle shifts in focus as unavoidable consequences of responsibility and time. Yet neuroscience tells a more precise story. Long-term alcohol use, even when culturally accepted and socially reinforced, can progressively reshape the architecture of the brain in ways that directly affect memory, attention, and emotional regulation. This is not a moral judgment, it is a biological reality grounded in neurochemistry and structural change. Chronic exposure to alcohol alters neurotransmitter systems, particularly gamma-aminobutyric acid and glutamate pathways, disrupting the delicate balance required for learning and memory consolidation. Over time, the hippocampus, the brain's central memory processor, becomes less efficient at encoding new experiences. Neurogenesis slows. Synaptic plasticity weakens. What once required little effort remembering names, tracking conversations, organizing complex tasks begins to demand more cognitive energy. In adults over 40, this shift can be especially pronounced because the brain is already navigating natural age-related changes in processing speed and neural resilience. Alcohol compounds these changes. Repeated exposure introduces oxidative stress and low-grade inflammation, both of which erode neural integrity. White matter pathways that coordinate communication between brain regions can lose efficiency, affecting executive function and working memory. You may still appear fully functional, still meeting deadlines and fulfilling obligations, but internally the brain is compensating. Compensation, however, has limits. The human brain is remarkably adaptive, yet it is not invincible. When alcohol becomes a regular coping mechanism for stress, loneliness, or achievement reward, the dopamine system recalibrates. Natural sources of satisfaction, exercise, connection, creativity produce less stimulation compared to alcohol's artificial surge. This recalibration subtly shifts motivation patterns, reinforcing repetition. Inspired by the clinical observations of addiction psychiatrist Dr. Anna Lempe, we can understand this process not as weakness, but as a predictable neurobiological loop. Pleasure and pain are processed in the same regions of the brain, functioning like a balance. Repeated stimulation of pleasure pathways through alcohol eventually tips the balance in the opposite direction, generating a baseline state of discomfort or dullness that demands more stimulation to feel normal. In midlife, when external pressures intensify and self-reflection deepens, this loop can accelerate quietly. The most concerning aspect is not dramatic intoxication, but the steady, normalized pattern of consumption that chips away at neural efficiency year after year. Memory decline does not usually announce itself with alarms. It arrives subtly, disguised as distraction. You may reread emails multiple times. You may struggle to retrieve words that once came effortlessly. You may attribute emotional volatility to fatigue without recognizing its neurological underpinnings. Alcohol interferes with REM sleep cycles, depriving the brain of critical overnight memory, consolidation. Even moderate drinking close to bedtime fragments sleep architecture, reducing the restorative processes that protect cognition. Over months and years, the cumulative effect becomes measurable. Brain imaging studies reveal volume reduction in key regions responsible for executive planning and emotional control. This is not fear-based speculation, it is documented evidence emerging from longitudinal research. Midlife is not a period of inevitable decline, it is a critical inflection point. The brain still retains plasticity, the capacity to repair and reorganize, but awareness must precede change. Understanding how chronic alcohol exposure alters memory circuits is the first step toward reclaiming cognitive vitality. The question is not whether you can function today. The question is whether the patterns you repeat now are shaping the brain you will rely on tomorrow. There is a moment in midlife when awareness begins to sharpen, when you sense that something deeper than stress may be unfolding beneath the surface. You notice that recalling recent conversations requires more effort. You misplace items more frequently. You rely heavily on digital reminders because your internal tracking system feels unreliable. At first, these adjustments appear adaptive and harmless. Yet beneath these subtle shifts, chronic alcohol exposure may be reshaping the circuitry that allows the brain to encode, store, and retrieve information with precision. The hippocampus, highly sensitive to toxic stress and chemical disruption, becomes less efficient at forming durable memories. Alcohol suppresses glutamate activity during intoxication and then triggers a rebound hyperexcitability during withdrawal, even if that withdrawal occurs overnight. This repeated cycle places strain on neural networks, gradually compromising synaptic strength. The brain attempts to compensate, recruiting adjacent regions to maintain performance, but compensation consumes metabolic resources and reduces long-term resilience. The distinction between reversible impairment and irreversible neurodegeneration becomes critically important at this stage. Early cognitive deficits related to alcohol are often functional rather than structural. Reduced neurogenesis, impaired sleep architecture, inflammation, and nutritional depletion can produce measurable memory lapses without permanent cell death. With sustained abstinence, balanced nutrition, and restored sleep, the brain can recover a significant portion of lost capacity. Synaptic plasticity improves, inflammatory markers decline. Cognitive clarity often returns gradually over months. However, when heavy alcohol use persists for years, structural damage can accumulate. Chronic exposure may contribute to cortical thinning, white matter degeneration, and in severe cases, alcohol-related dementia. Thiamine deficiency, common in prolonged heavy drinkers due to poor nutritional absorption, can precipitate Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, a devastating condition marked by profound memory disruption and confabulation. The tragedy is not that these outcomes exist, but that they often develop silently while individuals assume they are merely experiencing normal aging. Inflammation and oxidative stress play central roles in this process. Alcohol metabolism generates acetaldehyde and reactive oxygen species, both of which damage cellular structures. Microglial activation, the brain's immune response, may remain chronically elevated in heavy drinkers, creating a pro-inflammatory environment that interferes with neural communication. Over time, this inflammatory state disrupts the delicate equilibrium required for efficient cognition. Emotional regulation can also deteriorate because the prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control and long-term planning, becomes less synchronized with limbic structures. You may feel more irritable, less patient, and more reactive without connecting these changes to neurochemical imbalance. The mind interprets these shifts psychologically, but the origin is often biological. Here is where suspense enters the picture. The most dangerous phase is not late-stage collapse. It is the comfortable middle when life still appears stable. Career, relationships, and responsibilities remain intact, masking the progressive strain on neural systems. You may tell yourself that because you are successful, you are safe. Yet brain health does not negotiate with external achievements. It responds only to biochemical input and behavioral repetition. Each evening of habitual drinking reinforces neuroadaptive changes that subtly narrow cognitive flexibility. Each disrupted night of sleep weakens memory consolidation. Each nutritional shortcut compounds micronutrient depletion. The process is incremental, almost invisible, until one day the accumulation becomes undeniable. Midlife is therefore a decisive intervention window. The brain retains plasticity, but that plasticity depends on timely correction. Evidence-based strategies exist. Reducing or eliminating alcohol intake, restoring thiamine and essential nutrients, prioritizing deep sleep, engaging in aerobic exercise that stimulates neurogenesis, and cultivating social connection that naturally regulates dopamine. These actions are not abstract wellness trends, they are targeted neuroprotective measures. The difference between reversible impairment and permanent damage often hinges on the choices made during this phase. Awareness is the catalyst. Once you recognize that memory decline may not be inevitable aging but modifiable neurobiology, the narrative shifts from resignation to responsibility. The suspense resolves not in fear, but in possibility, because the brain you protect today determines the clarity you will possess tomorrow. The most empowering truth about the human brain is that it is dynamic, responsive, and relentlessly shaped by behavior. Even after years of habitual alcohol use, the brain is not a static organ condemned to decline. It is a living system governed by neuroplasticity, inflammation, metabolic balance, and environmental input. When alcohol is reduced or eliminated, a recalibration begins. Dopamine pathways gradually restore sensitivity. Sleep architecture stabilizes, allowing deeper REM cycles that consolidate memory and repair synaptic connections. The hippocampus can resume neurogenesis when oxidative stress decreases and nutritional deficiencies are corrected. This is not motivational fantasy, it is supported by longitudinal research in addiction medicine and cognitive neuroscience. The earlier the intervention, the greater the recovery potential. Midlife is not the closing chapter of growth, it is often the most strategic phase for decisive transformation. Evidence-based strategies to protect brain health are both practical and measurable. Sustained abstinence or significant reduction in alcohol intake reduces neuroinflammation and improves executive function over time. Thiamine repletion, alongside balanced intake of B vitamins, omega-3 fatty acids, and adequate protein, supports neuronal repair and neurotransmitter synthesis. Regular aerobic exercise increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a molecule essential for synaptic plasticity and memory formation. Resistance training enhances insulin sensitivity, which indirectly supports cognitive performance by stabilizing metabolic pathways. High-quality sleep, protected from alcohol-induced fragmentation, allows glymphatic clearance of metabolic waste products that accumulate during waking hours. Mindfulness practices reduce cortisol levels, minimizing stress-related hippocampal shrinkage. Social connection regulates dopamine and oxytocin systems in a natural, sustainable manner. Each of these interventions functions synergistically, amplifying recovery rather than acting in isolation. The philosophy underlying this approach echoes the work of Dr. Anna Lempsey, who emphasizes that the same brain circuits responsible for addiction are also responsible for resilience. The pleasure-pain balance can reset, but only when overstimulation ceases long enough for equilibrium to return. Discomfort during early abstinence is not evidence of failure, it is evidence of recalibration. The brain, accustomed to artificial surges of dopamine, must relearn how to derive satisfaction from ordinary experiences. This process requires patience and disciplined repetition. Yet what emerges on the other side is cognitive clarity that feels authentic rather than chemically induced. Memory sharpens. Emotional regulation stabilizes. Motivation becomes less volatile and more sustainable. Consider the broader implication. Protecting your brain is not solely about preventing dementia decades from now. It is about preserving agency today. When executive function remains strong, you make decisions aligned with long-term goals. When working memory is intact, you manage complexity without overwhelm. When emotional regulation is balanced, relationships deepen rather than fracture. Brain health is the infrastructure of autonomy. Alcohol, when used chronically, compromises that infrastructure gradually. Recovery rebuilds it deliberately. There is no dramatic turning point announced by sirens. The turning point is quiet and personal. It occurs when you decide that clarity is more valuable than temporary escape. It occurs when you recognize that midlife is not an excuse for decline but an opportunity for recalibration. The science is clear. Early corrective action meaningfully improves long-term outcomes. The uncertainty lies only in whether action is taken. You cannot control the passage of time, but you can control the inputs shaping your neural circuitry. Every choice either strengthens or strains the networks that will carry you into later decades. If you are benefiting from our topics, please subscribe, turn on the bell notifications so you can see our new videos early.